quick stories, and then just a couple lessons learned from this. And the first thing I just want to say is that I think I shared in my introductions that it's very bizarre to work for a denomination, to work at the top institutional level. So I work for the Global United Methodist Church in one of our general agencies. It's called the General Board of Church and Society. So on my very long business card, it says Kristin Kumpf, Director of Organizing for the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. So that is the title, which, as we've just discussed, is often prohibitive to the actual work of organizing, which is where my heart is. So something you all should just know about me, when people ask what model do you come out of, what tradition, what kind of an organizer are you, is I think sort of the subtext of that, like Alexia, I actually learned everything I know about what it means to be an organizer from living in the Philippines. So I actually spent some of the most incredible years of my life literally hiking in the mountains and the rainforest with indigenous communities who were being moved off their land by the military, working with international mining corporations who had bought the land kind of illegally from the government, who was then slowly moving people off their land. So it was an extraordinary experience for me as sort of a young college kid, just fresh out of college, to really think about, what does it mean to be in the midst of real struggles of justice, listening to people tell their stories, share their lives with me and with each other. And ultimately to ask the question of where's the church? Where does the church show up? What are we called to as people of faith? To be with people at the core of where they're at. So coming back from the Philippines, I got to be part of a team of organizers building a workers center in Los Angeles for Filipino workers. So we founded the Filipino Workers Center, which I'm so proud to say is still an extraordinary organization and group and really a movement in Los Angeles. And we worked with other worker movements in LA, had some really extraordinary moments of coming together, putting together the first big May Day march in LA that years after went on to be massive, I've been told, after I left LA. But one of the moments that transformed me and really taught me a lot about what it means to win, and again I want to use that with quotes because I think that there is all, as Wes so aptly said, there's all sorts of ways to look at what it means to be successful in this work. And how do we really take, again, sort of our vision and look at where we're going with that. And I think, and I've lost your names, I need all the names.
Me,
Yes.
Sue-Ann.
Sue-Ann. And Sue-Ann said before, relationships are not just as part of a strategy, but they are it. The relationships are really at the core of what grounds us. So when I was at the Filipino Workers Center, and the stories I want to share, and the reason I'm picking these stories, there's so many stories, because it's been an extraordinary time of doing this, but they're stories from moments in our history when our country was in a quote-unquote moment of crisis. And so when I think about where we stand today and sort of lessons learned from other moments when this country was really struggling and when that affected people in real and horrible ways, I wanted to share these stories of how we organized together to see change happen in people's lives. So in 2001, post 9/11, it was a time when our Muslim and immigrant brothers and sisters were not unlike now in a moment of fear and panic. And so we one day had a group of workers walk into our doors of our workers center who were animators. And it turned out that they were all working on the Rugrats movie. Any of y'all remember the Rugrats movie, right? Did you see that? Okay, yeah, so, yes, exactly, yes. So I know the guys who did that movie. So the animators for that, at least for the first Rugrats movie, were a group of Filipino and Korean animators who were brought to the US on a specialized visa, were working for Paramount Studios through a subsidiary organization. And so these workers walked into our office one day and said, we've been trying to figure out where we could go just to have some meetings to figure out what's just happened to us. And it turns out that this entire group of animators, all immigrant animators, working on a major motion picture for a major company in our country, had all been laid off as the movie was going into post-production. And in addition to that, none of them had any vacation or sick time during the course of making the movie. And then because they were suddenly laid off, they'd all been brought here on specialized visas connected to the company. They were all suddenly found themselves undocumented. And so what was interesting about that is that the first big thing they needed was just a space to be. A space where they could be together and hear each other's stories and try and just figure out how to make sense of what had just happened to them. And so creating those spaces in the Workers Center were a critical moment, but then what we started to do is, and really driven by them, which is the whole purpose, I think, in the end of organizing, as we've talked about so far, is people claiming a sense of their own voice and their own power. And we don't just do that as individuals, but we do that connected together. That we claim that sense of voice and power because we become this body of people, and often the body of Christ interconnected. And so what we saw was the workers, we slowly talked about, okay, what's your dream now? What does it mean to sort of move from this critical crisis moment into a better dream for your lives? What do you really want? And what was extraordinary is that their dream was not just about getting their papers and being documented, which was absolutely a piece of that. Their dream was not even just to suddenly have their families be here and be safe and secure and to see that for all their communities. Their dream went one step farther to that what they really wanted was to be accepted as human beings with dignity in the Los Angeles community. But they said, we are tired of going into our places of worship, of going into grocery stores, of going around the city, and people looking at us as less than. What we'd love is, especially for our fellow Christians, to get us, to be able to stand with us in our humanity and be our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so what happened in that moment, and again, by the sheer creativity of this team of leaders, of these workers, is they decided that both as a pathway to work on a campaign, to ultimately get their revised citizenship through getting another kind of visa, and really pushing the company to give them their back wages that they were due from working overtime and through endless hours without any pay. That they also really wanted to take around to the city, and especially to churches, to take an art exhibit that could also be a dialogue space, a space for dialogue. So these extraordinary artists created this art exhibit that they entitled The Struggles and Triumphs of Immigrant Workers. And they created murals and paintings, they created sculptures, and then they came up with then the conversations they wanted to have, and we just strategized together, okay, where are we going to go? What churches do you want to talk to? What neighborhoods do you want to be in? And we started touring this around the city, while at the same time slowly starting to raise support from the faith community through dialogue and ultimately relationship for their campaign. And what happened, and this is interesting, so I've actually met Alexi in these years when I was in LA, so often our stories will parallel. So we were at Emmanuel Presbyterian, which again is this extraordinary, massive church in LA. And of course, their director at the time, the director of liturgy at the time, also happened to be an actor in the animation industry, doing voiceovers. And so he said, you know what, as you do in LA, right? So he said, actually, interestingly enough, I know the actors who did the Rugrats movie. And I think they'd be very, very intrigued and concerned to find out what happened to these animators that created this movie for them. Wow. And so he reached out to them and brought them together, and not only were the actors so fired up and so angry about what was happening for these workers, but they said, we want to do two things. We want to do a benefit concert to bring together our whole community in solidarity with these workers. And we want to go to the company, and we want to tell the company they absolutely need to give these workers their back wages, they need to help, and then they need to be with them in this process for them to get another visa. And so they did. So we had this extraordinary benefit concert. And the moment that changed things forever for me as an organizer, I will never forget this moment, is when one of the actors stood up there and she looked straight in the eyes of the workers, and she said, I knew that you drew for me so that I could have a voice. But now I want to be a voice with you and for you, so that you always know that you have a voice, not only in this moment, in this campaign, but in this country. Wow. And it was this extraordinary moment of solidarity that became real through relationship. In the end, we won that campaign. The workers were able to get there, to get renewed, get a different kind of visa, to be able to stay in the country. Some of them are still extraordinary leaders in the Filipino community of Los Angeles. But two big lessons I learned from that were sort of my two of many grounding organizing lessons. Number one, I think it is in our places of pain often, and also places of passion, that we find our vision. So I think that campaign was extraordinarily different, and ultimately they were able to win even bigger than they expected, because they were able to, at the same time, tap into their pain, share that pain with each other in community, but also tap into their passion for what it really meant to be someone who was going to claim the dignity that they knew God had given them in solidarity with others in that city. And so that together led to a vision that united that group of workers in a way that then was able to lead them on into this campaign. And And the other huge and extraordinary lesson for me of that is that at the end of the day, this is all, as we keep talking about authentic, intentional, incarnational relationships. When we train on relationship building in my work, and again, this is something that we just created over the years, we always talk about it as we are building a special kind of relationship. Incarnational relationships is literally the God in me greets the God in you. That I am literally tapping into what it means to have the Spirit of God incarnated in me. And what difference does that make when I show up to you? And I've talked a lot this weekend about what I just experienced in Nebraska. Literally seeing some of the most conservative white Christian folk meet with undocumented immigrant workers, some of whom have just literally come out of sanctuary, who thought they were in a good place because they just won a campaign to actually get deferred status, and now are fearing for their lives. And yet through the course of a weekend of them journeying together, of them claiming their joint vision, and hearing each other's stories and relationship, they are now, I think, in a place where they're going to be able to travel more deeply together. And these white folk in Nebraska, I think, are committed to the sanctuary movement in a way they never were 48 hours ago. So in the end of the day, how are we being, and if we don't be intentional about it, it doesn't just happen, right? That we will have sort of relationships for the moment. But that journey of sort of building authentic, intentional, incarnational relationships is critical for us. Second story. Fast forward now, several years later, I'm now in Chicago. I'm working for a statewide immigrant rights coalition as their faith suburban organizer, which is sort of a hilarious statement to say, I was in charge for everything outside of Chicago area, so the rest of Illinois, and I was in charge with working with all of these churches, many of whom had experienced radical transformation in the previous years. So a lot of my towns I was working in will talk to me about how a decade ago they were all white. And now suddenly they saw 30, 40, 50% of their communities being immigrant, Latino, Mexican, lots of different types of immigrant communities that had moved in. And it changed not only the nature of their town, but it changed the nature of their churches. And it was often sort of a hilarious conversation for one church that talked about how they had, the Anglo service meeting at 10 a.m. in the morning. They had a Vietnamese service at 1 o'clock, and then the Latino service at 5 o'clock. And when we talked about, when did they all meet, the answer, of course, was never. Because they couldn't actually figure out logistically how to make it happen. So we slowly had been working on what it meant to build a new, again, taking the whole dream of what does it mean to have a vision, knowing that when we have a vision built in relationships, we can work on all kinds of change. And so in one town in particular, we had started to come together around electing the first ever Latina city council member. In their town, because it was a village, it was actually a village board member. So we had slowly started to build these relationships for that when suddenly the crisis hit. Some of you who've worked in the immigrant rights movement or worked in different solidarity movements over the years may remember that a really horrific bill passed the end of 2005. It's called the Sensenbrenner bill because it was one of the first pieces of legislation that actually said, you know what, people of faith who always just thought that it was cool for you to have a food pantry and drive people to school if they're undocumented. By the way, we want to have now legislation that will actually make that a criminal act. Felony. And a felony, thank you. Not just a criminal act, a felony. Wow. And so what was interesting is while we had seen lots of pieces of legislation that were incredibly terrifying for the immigrant community, this was the first time that it really impacted a lot of folks who sort of stood really comfortably by in solidarity. And so the first time, the folks were starting to think about, oh crap, maybe I could be implicated in this too. And so what happened is that you saw then the rise of the immigrant rights movement in 2006, that you saw lots of marches across the country, but there were other things that were happening in the small towns as pushback against that. Something really horrible happened in a town called Hazleton, Pennsylvania, where Hazleton decided that it would be a great idea to pass local legislation that made it a crime for anyone to rent housing to someone who's undocumented, or for anyone to hire someone who's undocumented. And that actually passed, an attempt to be legislated locally. Hazleton then ended up in a long legal battle, and eventually it was deemed unconstitutional. In the meantime, different towns across the country decided to try the same thing, including the village of Carpentersville, Illinois, which again, as I was just saying, was a town that we had already started organizing in, building relationships with the dream of electing their first ever Latina village board member. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a crisis. Here, we had a month before the village board meeting that very likely was going to be where this bill was going to actually be passed that would make it a crime for people in that town, again, to rent to people or to hire people. And so what happened is, I think the third big organizing lesson for me is that do not wait to build until you're in a crisis. If we wait to build relationships, to have a vision, as we all know, as we're here, right, it's too late. And so what is extraordinary to me, and this is again I think I've had a lot of really just moments of deep joy and pride in doing this work for a long time, but that to me was one of the most extraordinary moments, because it was a moment when we actually saw the few white people that had come together with the Latinos in this campaign to really get this woman elected, suddenly were like, crap, we need to get more people. We need to absolutely, literally cross the river to the west side of town where all the white folk live and talk to the churches and figure out a way to move forward to stop this bill from passing at our city council. And so what happened is, again, luckily, because they had already been building up over these relationships over time, they all went out and they built these really extraordinary teams in their churches that then were like satellite organizing teams that had a plan to go church to church, that started getting petitions, that literally started doing door knocking. We had a series of town hall meetings. We had a big, massive prayer vigil in front of the village hall. Finally, the night of the village board meeting, we had 3,000 people show up. It's a town of like 30,000 people where no one shows up for anything. 3,000 people show up. 279 people put their name on the list to give testimony at the town hall meeting. And for the first time, this never happens, they actually voted, in a very technical vote, voted basically to delay indefinitely the vote until they saw the legal ramifications that were happening with Hazelton. And so it was again this extraordinary moment, and a moment that reminded me of when we have already built up our people, our relationships, and our teams, we can then create a strategy that makes sense. But oftentimes when I'm working with folks and we're talking about what are our guiding questions, how do we focus in the midst of all the stuff that we could do and all of this craziness, I always say to you, tell me, what are you building and what are you changing? So have you really built the relationships needed to be connected in this community? Have you built up teams of people that can relate to each other? And ultimately, who's the who that can make the change happen? Are you clear about what you want to change? How does your vision become your goals, which become your strategy? Have you figured out a strategy of escalation to get to the point where you need to get to actually call our decision makers to account, which we heard so beautifully from Wes and from Alexia? And the final thing I just want to share is that in the midst of all of that, when we finally get to that point, when we're doing all that we can do, if it's petitions, and then we move on into doing a march, we move on to a prayer vigil, what does it mean to call on who we are as people of faith in all of our action? And so one of the most extraordinary recent organizing victories I've seen, it was working with people of faith, the Methodists, and building sort of interfaith networks, right here in Tennessee, fighting to get Medicaid expansion to happen through a bill called the Insure Tennessee bill. Now what's interesting about Insure Tennessee is actually the short end, since dinner bell has rung, is that the quote-unquote victory is that after 2 hard-fought legislative rounds, it didn't completely die, which is what we 100% expected in this red state, but we actually got to the point where they now have built a task force to look at alternatives. But at least it gives a platform for it still to be alive. But what was powerful in the midst of this is that on the final day of the vote, 850 people of faith, over 600 of them were folks that some of our organizers had organized, 850 people of faith showed up and held communion service in the halls of the Tennessee legislature. 850 people having communion together, down on their knees together. And so I feel like in that moment of solidarity, that having that chance to live out what it means to be people of faith, knowing we don't leave that at the door when we start organizing, but that is we absolutely bring that into our experience, and ultimately that is those moments, as we've heard from the others, is what helps us get to the point of being able to win in extraordinary ways that honor who we are as people in relationship with each other. So that's what we got.